The house sat on a calm street where most days felt slow and predictable. Trees lined both sides of the road, and lawns were trimmed more out of habit than competition. People waved when they passed each other, but no one really stopped to talk. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing big ever seemed to happen. That was exactly why the homeowner had chosen it. He was not someone who liked attention. He worked long hours, came home tired, and found peace in quiet routines. Mornings started with coffee by the window. Evenings ended with a short walk or time spent in the backyard. The lawn was green, healthy, and natural. It was not perfect, but it was cared for. Grass grew at its own pace. Flowers bloomed when they wanted to, and that felt right to him. The neighborhood had an HOA, but it rarely came up. Most residents barely noticed it existed. Fees were paid, newsletters were ignored, and rules stayed buried in old emails no one reread. For years, that system worked. No drama, no warnings, no tension. That changed one afternoon when a thin envelope appeared in the mailbox. At first, he thought it was junk mail, but the logo on the corner made him pause. It was from the HOA. He opened it slowly, expecting something routine. Instead, the letter talked about lawn height. It claimed his grass was above acceptable standards and asked for immediate correction. He walked outside and looked around. His lawn looked the same as it always had. Not wild, not overgrown, just normal. In fact, a few nearby lawns looked worse. He shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a mistake. He trimmed the grass that weekend anyway, just to avoid trouble. A few days later, another notice arrived. This one was firmer. It included a warning about possible fines. The wording felt sharp, almost personal. He read it twice, feeling a small knot form in his chest. It still didn't make sense. The grass was already cut. He even took photos on his phone, just in case. That was when he noticed something else across the street. A woman stood near the sidewalk, holding her phone up toward his yard. She wasn't pretending to talk or text. She was clearly taking pictures. When he stepped forward, she lowered the phone and walked away without a word. He felt uneasy, but told himself not to jump to conclusions. A week passed. Then another notice came. This time, it mentioned ongoing non-compliance. The words felt heavy, almost threatening. He read it late at night, sitting at the kitchen table. Lights dim, house quiet. His peaceful routine felt cracked. The next morning, he decided to call the HOA office. The call went to voicemail. He left a polite message. No response came back. Days later, a bright sticker appeared on his mailbox. It stated that a follow-up inspection had been done. The inspector's name was listed, but it was handwritten. Not typed. He recognized the handwriting from the notices, taped to community boards. It was the same woman from across the street. She was not an official inspector. She was a volunteer, someone who had taken it upon herself to enforce rules that no one else seemed to care about. She walked the neighborhood daily, clipboard or phone in hand, watching, measuring. Documenting neighbors had whispered about her before, but he had never paid attention. Now, he wished he had. One evening, as he pulled into his driveway, she approached him directly. She stood too close, pointing toward the grass with sharp movements. She spoke in a loud, confident voice, listing rules and standards as if reading from memory. She claimed she was just doing her job, and that he needed to take responsibility. He listened without interrupting. His face stayed calm, but inside frustration burned. He asked where the exact rule was written. She brushed the question aside and repeated that fines would come next, when she walked away. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at his lawn as if seeing it for the first time. It looked peaceful, ordinary, innocent. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure increased. Notices arrived faster. Some were emailed, others printed and taped near the door. One even included a photo taken from the sidewalk, zoomed in on a small, uneven patch of grass. It felt invasive. Neighbors began to notice. A few asked quietly if everything was okay. Others avoided eye contact, afraid to get involved. The woman continued her patrols. often stopping near his property longer than anywhere else. The homeowner felt singled out. Still, he did not raise his voice. He did not argue publicly. Instead, he began to document everything. He saved every notice. He took photos every time the lawn was cut. He noted dates, times, and even weather conditions. He also started reading the HOA documents carefully, something he had never bothered to do before. Late nights were spent scrolling through old files. Printed pages spread across the table. What he found confused him at first. The lawn rules were vague. Some sections contradicted others. Measurements were unclear. Updates had been proposed years ago, but never approved. It seemed like enforcement was based more on opinion than fact. That realization changed something inside him. The situation was no longer just about grass. It was about control. One afternoon, while trimming the edges, he noticed the woman standing nearby again. She watched silently, arms crossed, eyes fixed on every move. When he finished, she shook her head slightly and walked away. That evening, another email arrived. It stated that trimming was insufficient and that further action would be taken. For the first time, he felt anger rise to the surface. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. The quiet kind that sits deep and steady. He realized that no matter what he did, it would never be enough for her. This was not about rules. It was about power. Instead of reacting, he chose patience. He continued his routine. He smiled at neighbors. He kept records. He read more. He learned who actually sat on the HOA board and how complaints were supposed to be handled. He also noticed something interesting. The woman's own lawn did not follow many of the same standards she was enforcing. Uneven patches, decorations left out past allowed dates, minor violations that somehow went unnoticed. That detail stayed in his mind. Not as fuel for revenge, but as proof that something was wrong. By the end of the month, a formal notice arrived, stating that fines would begin if compliance was not achieved within 10 days. He placed the letter on the table and looked around his home. The quiet he once enjoyed felt threatened, but not gone. Instead of fear, felt clarity. He knew this was only the beginning. The next few days felt heavier than before. Every time the homeowner stepped outside, he could feel her eyes on him, even if she wasn't there. It was the kind of attention that made ordinary moments tense. Mornings, which had been calm with the sound of birds and distant traffic, now carried a sense of being watched. He noticed it in small ways. The snap of a branch under a neighbor's foot felt louder. The hum of his lawnmower seemed intrusive. Even walking to get the mail became an exercise in careful observation. Wondering if she was around the corner, taking notes or pictures? It wasn't just notices anymore. She began showing up in person, sometimes without any warning. One afternoon, he returned from work to see her standing near the sidewalk, measuring tape in hand, squinting at his lawn. She didn't smile. She didn't greet him. She simply took notes and whispered into her phone. When he tried to say hello, she quickly ended the call, gave a sharp nod, and walked down the street as if nothing had happened. It left him feeling unsettled. His home, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a stage under constant surveillance. Neighbors started noticing the tension too. A few approached him quietly, offering support in hushed tones. "We've all seen her," one neighbor said. "She does this a lot. Some of us just stay out of it because we don't want trouble." Another mentioned that she had been monitoring lawns in the neighborhood for years, keeping her own small log of violations, most of which went unchecked unless she reported them. It was clear that she thrived on control, not rules. But no one seemed willing to confront her directly. The homeowner realized he wasn't the only one being targeted, yet others were too cautious to act. At the next HOA meeting, things escalated further. The woman stood up and spoke with the kind of authority that felt rehearsed. She pointed to charts and photographs, many of which focused on his lawn. Her voice carried through the room as she detailed how he was repeatedly violating unspecified lawn standards. The homeowner sat quietly, taking careful notes. He noticed the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact. It became clear that the board allowed her behavior, whether because they didn't want conflict or because they believed her claims. Even outside the meetings, antics grew more public. She would linger near his driveway when neighbors walked by, subtly making comments about the state of the lawn. On one occasion, she stopped a mail carrier and loudly described his supposed violations, ensuring others heard her narrative. The homeowner felt humiliated but refused to react outwardly. He had learned that any emotional response could be twisted into evidence of guilt. Instead, he focused on documenting every encounter: dates, times, details of conversations. Photos of his lawn at the exact same time she visited everything went into a folder he kept meticulously. Late one evening, he decided to walk the neighborhood, hoping to gauge whether she had noticed him or if he could observe her habits without confrontation. It was quiet, the street bathed in soft light from street lamps. He saw her several houses down, clipboard in hand, talking to another neighbor while casually glancing toward his property. She was everywhere at once, and yet she remained invisible to most. She seemed to thrive on being seen by him, but ignored by everyone else. It felt strategic, calculated, almost theatrical. The realization left him both frustrated and strangely impressed by her persistence. During the following week, another layer of tension emerged. She began taking photographs from angles that required leaning over fences or walking near property lines. Every step felt intrusive. He noticed her using a phone with a zoom lens on multiple occasions, capturing close-ups of small patches of grass or flower beds. It wasn't enough for him to see what she was doing. He had to start recording his own evidence to counter her claims. Late at night, he organized a small system, a camera positioned in the backyard that could capture the front yard without invading anyone else's space, a detailed log of every inspection, and even a map noting the times she usually appeared. The effort consumed hours, but he realized it was necessary to protect himself. The psychological toll began to show. While he remained outwardly calm, the constant scrutiny made simple decisions difficult. Walking across the yard to pick up the newspaper became calculated. Opening the blinds required checking first if she was watching. Even casual conversations with neighbors included subtle monitoring, weighing every word to avoid giving her any excuse. At night, he found it hard to sleep. He replayed interactions in his mind, imagining different responses, wondering if he had already violated some arbitrary rule in her view. The quiet house felt smaller and heavier. One afternoon, as he mowed the lawn, she appeared again. This time she brought a measuring wheel, rolling it slowly across the grass while making notes. She stopped frequently, squatted down to inspect certain areas, and occasionally looked at him with an expression that mixed judgment and satisfaction. For the first time he felt a flicker of anger rise, sharp and immediate. But he swallowed it, understanding that she wanted exactly that reaction. Instead, he continued his work quietly, pretending not to notice her presence while keeping his phone ready to record evidence. As the weeks went by, her behavior shifted toward intimidation. Notices arrived faster, some stapled to the front door, others tucked under the doormat. One included a warning that non-compliance could result in legal action, though no specifics were provided. It was vague enough to be threatening, yet legally unenforceable, without clear rules. He noticed that many of her letters used language designed to pressure rather than inform, phrasing everything as an accusation. The subtle, relentless pressure weighed heavily. He felt the first real sense of fear since the entire ordeal began. At the same time, he began noticing cracks in her authority. During a casual conversation with a neighbor, he learned that she had no formal position in the HOA beyond being a volunteer. Her power came from persistence, not legitimacy. Many of her own minor violations went unnoticed or unreported. The realization sparked a mix of relief and determination in him. While she could harass, threaten, and embarrass, she could not enforce the rules alone. Knowledge became his weapon. Patience became his shield. By the end of the month, the pattern had solidified. She arrived at unexpected times, inspected yards with exaggerated precision, and created an aura of constant vigilance. Yet he remained calm, documenting everything, studying the bylaws, and noting the inconsistencies in her claims. His life had changed subtly. The yard that once felt like freedom now felt like a test, and every day became a careful exercise in restraint and observation. Still, he did not give in to panic. He knew that patience, preparation, and evidence would eventually tip the scales in his favor. Neighbors continued to whisper. Some admired his calm approach. Others feared drawing attention themselves. Meanwhile, she persisted, convinced of her authority, unaware that he had already begun to quietly prepare for a response that would not only protect his home, but also reveal the truth about her overreach. The tension grew, but the homeowner understood one crucial thing. The story was no longer about the grass. It was about accountability, fairness, and knowing the rules better than the person trying to enforce them. And he intended to use that knowledge to his advantage. The homeowner spent hours each evening poring over HOA documents. He had never thought he would need to become an expert on bylaws, amendments, and vague clauses buried in years-old newsletters. It was tedious work, but he found himself drawn into it. There was a sense of control in knowing the rules, understanding them clearly, and spotting the gaps. For weeks he had been under constant scrutiny, and for the first time, he felt the possibility of turning the tables. As he flipped through printed pages, he noticed contradictions. One section mentioned a maximum grass height of 6 inches, but another, older section referred to 8 inches. Some rules applied only to front lawns, while others mentioned side yards. The language was confusing, full of vague terms like well-maintained and neat appearance, but no one had ever defined them clearly. His own yard, measured carefully, fit well within the limits. It was frustrating to realize how much power someone could claim over another person's property when the actual rules were murky. Late one evening, a neighbor knocked on his door. She was older, lived a few houses down, and had watched the HOA woman's antics for years. "You're not the first," she said quietly, glancing around as if the woman could be listening from somewhere. "She does this to everyone who doesn't fight back. She's not enforcing rules. She's picking favorites, or maybe she just likes the feeling of control." Her words hit him hard. It wasn't just about his lawn. It was about pattern, manipulation, and power. And he realized that knowledge alone was not enough. He needed strategy. He began carefully comparing each notice she had sent with the HOA documents. Dates, phrasing, and the nature of her claims started to form a pattern. Many of the violations she listed were not actually enforceable. Some cited rules that had been repealed or never formally approved. Others were subjective opinions disguised as authority. The more he read, the more he understood that her power came from intimidation and the assumption that people would not check the facts. Most residents, he realized, simply paid fines or adjusted their yards to avoid confrontation because it was easier than questioning her. One night, while reviewing his own records, he made a discovery that surprised him. The HOA woman's own property violated several of the same rules she had been citing against him. Her grass in front of the house was longer than allowed. Ornaments were placed outside of approved times, and she had a few plants that were technically not permitted. The thought that she could enforce rules selectively while ignoring her own violations was both frustrating and validating. It proved that her obsession with his yard had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with control. Instead of confronting her immediately, he decided on a careful plan. He would gather evidence, verify every rule, and prepare to present it clearly. The goal was not revenge. It was to show that her claims had no legal foundation. In the meantime, he continued to maintain his lawn normally. He refused to overcompensate by making it perfect according to her standards, which would have fed her power. Instead, he kept the yard clean, healthy, and exactly as he wanted, documenting every step. Photos were taken from multiple angles. Measurements were recorded. Dates were noted. Even weather conditions were logged to counter any argument about neglect. During rainy weeks, the woman continued her patrols, unaware that her own credibility was eroding. She appeared at odd hours, sometimes crouching close to the ground to inspect blades of grass or photographing small sections of the lawn. Every visit seemed calculated to annoy or intimidate. But the homeowner had grown patient. He recorded everything, maintained his calm demeanor, and avoided engaging her directly. He even practiced neutral responses in his mind, knowing that any emotional reaction could be twisted into an admission of guilt. His discipline became a quiet form of resistance. One afternoon, he decided to speak with a few board members privately. He shared his concerns about selective enforcement and vague rules. Their reactions were mixed. Some seemed sympathetic, but hesitant, citing fear of conflict. Others claimed they had trusted the volunteer to handle enforcement. He realized the board itself had been passive, allowing one person's personal obsessions to dominate neighborhood policy. That knowledge reinforced his strategy. He could not rely on others to fix the problem. He would have to create a record so clear that no one could ignore it at the same time. He began to notice how neighbors reacted differently around the HOA woman. Some would hurry past, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered in small groups about her strictness. A few even admitted quietly that they had bent rules or altered their yards just to avoid her attention. The homeowner saw an opportunity. By remaining calm, well-informed, and prepared, he could inspire others to stand up for themselves too. But only after he had established his own position. He spent evenings drafting clear notes, organizing evidence, and planning how he would present his case if needed. Every photograph, every scanned notice, every recorded observation had a purpose. He labeled everything by date and subject, creating folders that were meticulous and easy to follow. Even small details mattered. For instance, she had once claimed a patch of grass was unacceptably dry, but he had a photo showing that it had rained the day before her inspection. These small pieces of evidence accumulated, forming a stronger narrative with each passing week. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Before he had felt intimidated, anxious, and constantly watched. Now he felt in control of his own story. The surveillance that had once been oppressive became data. The notices that had seemed threatening became points to counter. Every attempt to bully him was cataloged and prepared to be disproven. He was no longer reacting out of fear but acting strategically. His focus moved from frustration to empowerment. One evening, while reviewing his collection of evidence, he realized the full scope of what he had uncovered. Not only did he have proof that her claims were inconsistent with HOA rules, but he also had evidence of selective enforcement and her own violations. He could see a path forward where he would no longer be the victim, but the one presenting facts. It was a slow, methodical approach, but it felt satisfying. Patience had become his ally, knowledge his strongest weapon. He also began documenting small moments that previously would have gone unnoticed. The times she made comments to neighbors, the occasions she lingered longer at certain properties, even minor social interactions during HOA meetings, all of it formed a complete picture of her behavior. This record was more than just defense. It was a map of patterns, motives, and inconsistencies that no casual observer could ignore. The more he documented, the more confident he became that he could show the board and neighbors the truth. It's not through confrontation, but through evidence. Meanwhile, she continued her routines. She came at dawn or dusk, sometimes walking slowly with exaggerated gestures, taking notes or photos. Her sense of authority seemed unshakable, and to the casual observer, she looked like she was simply enforcing the rules. But the homeowner knew better. He understood that power based on fear, opinion, and selective observation was fragile when confronted with documented facts. That understanding allowed him to stay calm, even when she tried to provoke him with pointed remarks or lingering stares. By the time the weeks passed, he felt a growing sense of anticipation. He was ready. He knew the rules better than anyone, had all the evidence carefully organized, and understood the weaknesses in her claims. His patience, discipline, and meticulous record-keeping had transformed the situation from a source of constant stress into an opportunity. The psychological weight had shifted. No longer was he at the mercy of her personal vendetta. He had prepared himself to present facts in a way that could not be ignored. Neighbors continued to watch quietly, some silently cheering, some unsure of what would happen next. The homeowner felt that he was no longer alone in spirit. even if the streets remained quiet. The knowledge that he could finally respond with clarity and authority gave him energy. He knew the next step would require courage, but it would be based on truth, not fear. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of empowerment growing within him. The HOA woman had spent weeks trying to intimidate him. But now, armed with understanding, evidence, and patience, he was ready to turn the situation around. The day of the next HOA meeting arrived with an unusual tension in the air. Normally, these gatherings were brief and uneventful. People arrived, paid attention for a little while, signed documents, and left. But this time felt different. The homeowner had spent weeks preparing. Every document was organized. Every notice, photo, and measurement was labeled and cross-referenced. Every conversation, date, and observation was noted. He had rehearsed in his mind how he would speak calmly, clearly, and without letting anger show. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake. It was to reveal the truth, to show that the woman's actions were based on opinion and intimidation rather than actual rules. He arrived early, carrying a neat folder with all his evidence. He placed it on the table, double-checked the order, and took a seat in the back, observing the room. Familiar faces greeted him with polite nods, though some carried a hint of curiosity. It was clear that the neighborhood had sensed tension, and whispers about his preparation had begun circulating quietly. People had been waiting to see how he would handle the situation that had caused months of drama. He felt calm, but focused. This was the moment when patience, careful documentation, and quiet strategy would meet reality. The HOA woman arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand, as if nothing had changed. She carried herself with the same air of authority, confident that her years of self-appointed enforcement had given her power over the neighborhood. She scanned the room, settling her gaze on the homeowner, a small, satisfied smile forming. She believed she would intimidate him into silence again. But this time, the homeowner felt no fear. He understood her methods, her motives, and, most importantly, the weaknesses in her authority. The meeting began with routine announcements, minor procedural matters, and financial reports. The homeowner listened quietly, making mental notes about how others responded to her presence. Some board members shifted uneasily. It was clear that while they had allowed her influence in the past, her behavior was now under observation by more people. He waited patiently, allowing her to finish any preliminary points before he made his move. Timing, he knew, would be key. When the agenda reached neighborhood compliance issues, she immediately began speaking. Her voice carried across the room, loud and precise, as she described supposed violations on his property. She waved a few photographs in the air, highlighting small imperfections and uneven patches of grass. She recited dates, measurements, and minor details, as if to overwhelm the audience with her authority. Board members nodded at first, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of assumption that she was correct. The homeowner took a deep breath, listening, letting her words fill the space. Every point she made, he knew he could counter with evidence. Every claim she asserted could be disproven with the documents he had meticulously collected. Finally, it was his turn. He rose slowly, deliberately, and spoke in a calm, clear voice. "I'd like to address the concerns that have been raised about my property," he began, placing his folder carefully on the table. He opened it, revealing a stack of neatly organized documents, each clearly labeled. "I have reviewed the HOA rules and bylaws, and I would like to present my findings." He started by explaining the inconsistencies he had found. Some rules cited in previous notices had been repealed. Others were vague, unenforceable, or applied selectively. He pointed to specific pages, reading aloud the exact language, ensuring everyone could follow along. His tone was firm but neutral, avoiding any hint of anger or defensiveness. He wanted clarity, not conflict. The room became quiet. Board members leaned forward, looking at the documents, following the references. The HOA woman's confident expression faltered slightly as he systematically demonstrated how her claims did not match the official rules. Every photograph she had presented was countered by one of his own, taken on the same day, showing compliance. Measurements, dates, and notes from previous inspections were cross-referenced with the bylaws. He even included weather records to prove that certain patches of grass she had criticized were naturally affected by rain or sun, not neglect. She opened her mouth to respond, but he calmly continued. "I want to emphasize that my goal is not to argue or create tension," he said. "I simply want to ensure that enforcement is based on the rules that actually exist and are clear to everyone." His words were measured, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. The confidence in his approach contrasted sharply with her reactive gestures. She shuffled papers nervously, trying to regain control. But the methodical presentation of facts made it difficult. He then presented perhaps the most striking part of his evidence: documentation of her own violations. Photographs, notes, and measurements demonstrated that her property did not fully comply with the same rules she had been enforcing. The room reacted quietly at first, but the weight of the evidence became obvious. Board members exchanged glances, some frowning, some nodding slowly. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer in full control. Her selective enforcement was now visible to everyone in the room. Throughout the presentation, neighbors began whispering, some leaning closer to see the documents. The homeowner noticed subtle shifts. People who had once avoided speaking were now looking on with interest, perhaps even admiration. The narrative he had prepared, grounded in facts and calm reasoning, began to dominate the room. The atmosphere changed from tension to clarity. It was no longer about fear or personal vendettas. It was about rules, evidence, and fairness. By the time he finished, he had not only addressed every accusation, but had also highlighted the inconsistencies in her behavior, her selective enforcement, and the lack of clarity in the HOA's documentation. He closed the folder and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of board members and neighbors alike. There was a moment of silence, a pause in which the room absorbed the magnitude of what had just been presented. The woman's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by discomfort and uncertainty. She attempted a brief rebuttal, but the homeowner's calm authority and meticulously organized evidence left little room for argument. A board member finally spoke. "We will need to review these findings carefully," he said. "It appears there have been inconsistencies in enforcement," another added. "It is important that we base all actions on documented rules and not personal opinion." The homeowner nodded slightly, maintaining a calm demeanor, knowing that the words carried more weight than any emotional outburst could have. The HOA woman was now being held accountable in a way she had not expected. The homeowner felt a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. Months of preparation, patience, and careful documentation had culminated in this moment. He had not shouted, threatened, or acted impulsively. He had simply presented facts clearly, calmly, and persuasively. The contrast between his methodical approach and her previous aggression made it clear to everyone in the room who was acting professionally and who was not. Even after the meeting formally ended, the shift in dynamics continued. Board members approached him privately, thanking him for his clarity and for bringing attention to inconsistencies that had long gone unnoticed. Neighbors offered quiet congratulations, expressing relief that someone had finally addressed the situation openly and fairly. The woman herself lingered, visibly stunned, unable to immediately respond. The homeowner chose not to press further, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The surprise, his calm and thorough preparation, had worked exactly as he intended. Later, as he walked home, he reflected on the months of tension and uncertainty. The quiet intimidation, the invasive photographs, the relentless notices all had felt overwhelming at the time. But each step, from documenting every interaction to learning the bylaws in detail, had been part of a deliberate strategy. He realized that the most powerful response to harassment was not confrontation through anger, but preparation through knowledge. By understanding the rules, observing carefully, and presenting evidence calmly, he had turned a stressful situation into a demonstration of fairness and accountability. That evening, he sat on his porch looking at his lawn as the sun began to set. It was the same yard she had scrutinized for months, but it now felt different. The fear and anxiety had been replaced with quiet confidence. He understood the rules, had documented the facts, and had demonstrated fairness and professionalism. The neighborhood, which had watched silently, now saw that one person's attempt at control could be challenged without drama, without anger, and without personal attacks. The homeowner had not just protected his lawn. He had set a standard for accountability and integrity. The HOA woman, once confident in her unchecked authority, now faced the reality that her personal judgment alone could not override rules and evidence. The homeowner's preparation had revealed the truth to the board, to neighbors, and to anyone paying attention. The balance of power had shifted, quietly but definitively. The months of tension, observation, and careful planning had culminated in a moment of clarity, respect, and resolution that no one could ignore. For the homeowner, the day was more than just a victory over a difficult situation. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, and calm perseverance. He had demonstrated that knowledge and preparation were stronger than intimidation. He had shown that fairness, clarity, and integrity could prevail, even against someone who believed that personal authority was enough to control others. The surprise he had planned, executed with careful thought and evidence, had left the HOA woman stunned, the board aware, and the neighborhood reassured. The story of months of tension had reached a turning point, one that promised accountability, fairness, and finally, peace. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to change. The subtle tension that had hovered for months started to fade. The homeowner walked back to his house with a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. The months of stress, worry, and quiet planning had led to this moment, and the sense of relief was almost tangible. He knew, however, that one meeting alone would not completely resolve the situation. The HOA woman might still resist, and some members of the board would need to act formally to make sure fairness was restored. But he felt confident. Everything was documented. Everything was clear. And now, the community had witnessed it too. Within a few days, the HOA board called another meeting, this time to address the findings the homeowner had presented. The woman, who had once commanded attention with her self-assigned authority, arrived with visible tension. Her confident posture was replaced by hesitation. The board read through the evidence carefully, discussing points that had been ignored for too long. They asked questions about specific bylaws, dates, and notices. The homeowner quietly observed, knowing that the facts would speak louder than any emotional arguments. His presence alone, calm and prepared, set the tone for accountability. The board then made decisions that would affect both the homeowner and the HOA woman. First, they officially removed her from any role in enforcing lawn rules or monitoring neighbors. Her volunteer authority was rescinded. She could still attend meetings, but she no longer had the power to issue warnings, take photos, or measure lawns. The board cited her selective enforcement and the inconsistencies documented in the homeowner's evidence. They acknowledged that her actions had caused unnecessary stress and tension, and that fairness required clear, documented procedures. The homeowner listened quietly, a sense of quiet satisfaction building within him. Justice, in a simple but undeniable form, had been done. Next, the board addressed the fines she had attempted to impose. They were canceled immediately. Any pending penalties were voided. Notices were sent to the homeowner, confirming that his property was fully compliant with HOA standards. It was a formal acknowledgement that the months of intimidation and threats had no legal or procedural basis. He read the letter carefully, smiling quietly. The relief was more than financial, it was symbolic. The pattern of harassment, fear, and selective enforcement had been broken. His home, once a place of anxiety, was now restored to a place of peace. Neighbors began to respond to the shift as well. Some who had stayed silent for months now approached him, quietly expressing relief and admiration. "It feels good to see fairness restored," one neighbor said. "We were all watching, and no one had the courage to speak up until you did." Others shared stories of their own small encounters with the HOA woman. Realizing that she had operated similarly with multiple households, the homeowner listened with empathy, offering reassurance without judgment. He realized that his calm, prepared approach had inspired others to trust that rules and fairness could prevail. Even when intimidation seemed overwhelming, the HOA woman, meanwhile, faced social consequences that went beyond her formal removal. She became quieter at meetings, more cautious in her interactions, and visibly aware that her selective enforcement had been exposed. Some neighbors began to avoid discussing her in public, while others were more assertive in defending their rights. The balance of power had shifted. The months of fear, scrutiny, and public shaming that she had inflicted on others now reflected back on her in a subtle but undeniable way. Her tactics, once effective, were no longer sufficient in a community that had witnessed the homeowner's careful, calm, and evidence-based approach. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The quiet streets, the calm routines, and the friendly greetings resumed. The homeowner continued to maintain his lawn, but now he did so without fear or pressure. His care was guided by his own standards and love for his home, not the arbitrary and invasive scrutiny of one individual. Each morning felt lighter, each evening calmer. Even when the HOA woman passed by, she no longer paused to observe or make comments. The tension that had dominated months of his life had finally lifted. The homeowner took a moment to reflect on what he had learned. The ordeal had been stressful and emotionally taxing, but it had also revealed important truths. Knowledge was power. Patience was strength. Calm, evidence-based responses could overcome fear and intimidation. The situation had shown him that standing quietly, observing carefully, and preparing methodically could be more effective than confrontation driven by anger or emotion. He had learned to turn frustration into strategy and uncertainty into clarity. It was a lesson that went beyond the lawn. It applied to life, relationships, conflicts of all kinds. He also recognized the impact on the community. Others had observed his approach, seen the calm and systematic way he handled the harassment, and learned that rules, fairness, and accountability could be defended without hostility. Quietly, he had helped set a precedent that no single individual could overstep authority without being checked, and that preparation and evidence could level the playing field. The neighborhood began to feel safer, more transparent, and more united. People spoke up when minor issues arose, supported one another, and were more willing to engage with the HOA in constructive ways rather than fear-driven compliance. There was also a personal sense of victory, not in terms of pride or ego, but in resilience. He had endured months of scrutiny, stress, and subtle intimidation, yet he had remained calm, focused, and methodical. He had turned an oppressive situation into one where